All right, we're recording now. I forgot to do it earlier, but we did our organization introduction, and now I'm going to turn it over to Brian. Brian, if you want to start out just talking a little bit about yourself, what you do, and kind of how you got, involved in researching and writing about this topic.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Um, I got into this through my wife, Elaine, actually. My wife is a nurse practitioner, and several years ago, not long after we had moved to Atlanta, she was working at a community health center here called Mercy Care. And we share a car, so every day I would pick her up and we would debrief our days. I had just finished a magazine story. About something very much unrelated to housing and homelessness. And Elaine was telling me about this trend that she was seeing among her patients. She noticed that one patient after another, they were working jobs like packing boxes in Amazon warehouses or driving for Uber and Lyft or delivering food for DoorDash or home health aides or daycare workers, any number of these jobs. And when they finished their shifts, when they got off of work, they weren't going to an apartment. In one case, a man who was working on movie sets in Atlanta, part of Atlanta's burgeoning film industry, was sleeping in a tent encampment. There were there were individuals who were sleeping in the very cars that they had done airport runs for Uber and Lyft in. People were living in overcrowded apartments with others, and they were also living in these extended stay hotels. Maybe we'll be able to get a little bit more into the world of extended stay hotels, because I argue that they constitute a really critical node sort of in the ecosystem of American homelessness today. But when Elaine told me about this trend of people who were working and working and working some more, and it still wasn't enough to have housing, to have not even stable housing, just housing, period, I was really surprised. I wondered if this was some bizarre anomaly that she was observing, or whether it was somehow representative of a larger trend. And as a journalist and before that as an anthropologist, I have a PhD in cultural anthropology. I had done a lot of research over the years on economic injustice, inequality, not only in the US, but in different areas around the world. I had never seen the link between work and homelessness explicitly like thematized, much less investigated and unpacked. And indeed, when I went to an academic search engine and typed in the words working homeless around that time, not only was there not this plethora of literature that I was sort of expecting to find, like maybe I had missed this. Not only was that not there, but when work was discussed in relation to homelessness, it was what was missing. Work was what ostensibly liberated one from this most severe form of deprivation. Work was not something that accompanied, or as I would come to argue, even could instigate this form of deprivation. To the extent that I argue that I would come to argue that a low wage job, a particular kind of low wage job in America today, increasingly gigified or contracted out, and stripped of basic benefits, that this kind of low wage job is actually homelessness waiting to happen. Suffice it to say that idea was very much missing from the literature that I began to dive into. And so that was the initial kind of impetus for me to start reporting in Atlanta, first following one family here in Atlanta over a period of several months. And I ended up writing that story for the New Republic. This one family had been displaced from a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in Atlanta called Peoplestown. And by the time I met this family, Kokethia Goodman and her kids, they had been homeless for several months. After I finished that piece, I just realized I had only scratched the surface of what there was to know about this phenomena. A big theme that emerged in the course of reporting that story, and that would become a very prominent sort of motif or even argument in the book, is that um, counterintuitively, all of this insecurity, all of this homelessness, this skyrocketing homelessness, um, not only in Atlanta, but in cities across the country, is happening against the backdrop not of a failing economy, but a booming economy. Cities like Atlanta, and I really want to insist that although the book is based in Atlanta, um, it really is representative of any number of other cities across the country, including Seattle, Nashville, Charlotte. I've gone to so many cities over the last year since the book came out, and people are saying, this is what's happening here, where what we're witnessing is this kind of revitalization of urban space, where what used to be called the inner city has now been transformed into a playground for those rich enough to enjoy all the new amenities and green space and everything else. And that's really the backdrop. This is a crisis, I argue, not of poverty, but of prosperity, a very particular kind of prosperity. And so this sort of dynamic where property values are skyrocketing, where urban space is being transformed, where cities are undergoing a much celebrated renaissance, and the very people whose work, whose labor is making that growth possible. Not people on the fringes of society, but people who are actually making our cities run, making our cities grow, are not only being pushed out of the neighborhoods they grew up in, but increasingly being pushed out of housing altogether. And so that was something that I felt like I had only kind of touched on in my early reporting, and felt like I needed to keep going to fully understand.
Great, thank you for the intro. Yes, we're definitely feeling that same push here in Seattle where there's so much prosperity, right? We're the home of Amazon and Microsoft and everything, but people are continually getting pushed out. So yeah, same parallels as we saw in your book. Um, what was your process for writing? How long did you kind of write this book over a period of time, and where did you find the families? Was this through your wife's work, or how did you identify who you wanted to profile in your book?
Yeah, I knew early on that if this book was going to mean anything or do anything or shift people's perceptions or sensibilities around homelessness, uh, readers would need to kind of be immersed in the lived experiences, the lived realities of those forced to suffer this kind of precarity. And um, I actually I did an event not long after the book came out with one of my heroes, a labor organizer named Sarah Nelson, who's the head of the flight attendant union, and she her response to the book is something that has almost become a kind of guiding, like in retrospect, a kind of guiding impulse for the book. She said that before we can fix this crisis, we first have to feel the crisis, and um, and without using those words precisely, because I hadn't heard them yet, I think that was very much what was animating my reporting from the beginning. Drawing on my training as an anthropologist, I really wanted to approach this more as an ethnographer might approach kind of immersive field work, and not as a kind of journalist who's dropping in, getting the story, so to speak, getting the interviews, and then writing the book. I wanted the fullness of people's humanity, not only parents but children too. I wanted that to be made real to readers, and so in order to do that, I mean, it felt and in retrospect really seems miraculous. Like it was a gargantuan task to ask not just, one family, but multiple people, multiple families to allow me into their lives, into their worlds in such a way that the lived texture of their lives would be felt. And I didn't actually set out to write only about families. I went into this very much wanting to kind of check all these different demographic boxes. I wanted single people. I wanted to find families. I wanted to find, the kind of white working class people, families, individuals, along with, here in Atlanta, homelessness, housing insecurity is deeply racialized. So I knew there would also need to be Black families or individuals in the mix as well. But what I ended up with, which is really five Black families, is largely the result, I think, of not just the contingencies of I how I encountered these people, these adults and their children, through I met them through like this wide network of church volunteers and caseworkers and food pantry volunteers and many others who, over the course of a long period of time, in going back to when I was reporting that initial story for the New Republic, would, text me, call me, you've got to meet this family, you've got to go to this place. All of the people who ended up being in the book, I kind of met in these very unforeseen or contingent ways like that. But just going back to like the desire to check all these demographic boxes, the reality is that while we have this cliche in America that anybody can become homeless, that homelessness is kind of colorblind, in a city like Atlanta that is no longer majority Black, 93% of families who are unhoused are Black. And so to like go out and find the kind of one white family over here, um, there's something that came to feel kind of forced about that. And so that's something I really struggled with. I didn't want to reinforce this idea that the face of homelessness is Black, or in different regions of the country, it's racialized in different ways. So like in Minnesota, where I was recently, there's Indigenous and Native American people are disproportionately at risk of being pushed into homelessness. Or I've reported in Northern California where Latino and migrant communities are disproportionately impacted by these issues. And so, but here in Atlanta, that's what it looked like. And so, yeah, building trust was a huge factor. I went into this not saying to the families who I met, hey, I'm a journalist and I'm doing a book about homelessness. Can I interview you and get your story? It was much more human. It was in like to give an example, a church volunteer named Phyllis called me one night and said that she was supposed to bring food to a family that had recently become homeless. They were now staying at a place called Efficiency Lodge, and I had never heard of this hotel, even though it was very close to where I live. And she said, would I mind bringing them food because her car broke down? And so I drove there at like 9 o'clock on a Friday night and brought them Little Caesars. And the woman who came down to my car, she didn't want me to get out because she thought, it. She said it was a little sketchy at night. She came down to the car. She got the pizzas. Her name was Michelle, and she ended up being one of the central people in this book. But she asked me the next, I gave her the pizza. She said, my kids and I, we could also use some like toiletries and different personal items. Is there any way you could come back tomorrow? And so I said, of course. I came back the next day and she just began to tell me her story. And I can't remember if I was crying, but she was certainly crying. We were both very emotional. And I said to her, my God, Michelle, like people need to hear this. People need to see this. Like people need to see what it's like to be in your shoes, to be trying as hard as you are, and it still isn't enough. Um, and she had been kind of living with this internalized judgment from people in her life that somehow this was her fault. And so she was really eager to share her side, her perspective. And so when I asked her, Michelle, I'm writing this book, and would it be possible for me to just kind of like be with you guys and just be a presence and just accompany you through whatever else comes? And I had no idea what else would come. I mean, some really horrific and harrowing stuff in her story particular, would come. And I had no idea at that time, but she just kind of agreed to take part in this, what in some ways was kind of a collaboration. Like, how can we allow the world to see this in the most visceral, real way possible? And it kind of unfolded like that with all of the families in their own specific ways.
Well, thanks for that context. And I was really curious since you don't get into the book, kind of how you, I thought that it was a deliberate, was seeking out families and because that was a theme across all of them. But good to hear that that's just kind of fell into place. While we're talking about the family, a lot of people here, I imagine, have not had a chance to read the book. I will put a link in the chat just to locally where you can get it, but you can find it, online anywhere, and I'm sure at your local stores. But since a lot of folks haven't read the book, would you mind maybe taking us through maybe a part of one family's journey? Because everyone encounters so many different failures of the system, in your story. But if you want to just go through maybe one family or just a few different experiences of multiple families to kind of illustrate the kinds of, situations that you saw them having to figure out.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I wish I could tell you about each of the five families. Each of their journeys are so distinctive in their own ways, and even though going into it, this wasn't necessarily something I could plan out. I now see that each of their stories kind of like illuminates a different aspect of this larger crisis in important ways. Um, yeah, I was thinking I would tell you a little bit about Britt. Britt is actually the person who gives us the title of this book, There Is No Place for Us. Britt, her roots in Atlanta go back 5 generations. She was born at East Lake Meadows, which shortly after this public housing development was completed in the early 70s, became known as Little Vietnam. That was sort of its portrayal in the media. And many old Atlanta residents, that is how they know it and remember it. But for Britt and her family, her relatives who lived at East Lake Meadows, it was a place where community was forged despite really terrible conditions and circumstances. It was very quickly defunded, like much of public housing in America, not long after it was constructed. And so from the very beginning, there were just awful, awful maintenance issues, structural issues at these apartments, and that kind of mirrored a lot of the violence and other conditions that proliferated there. But when Bree was a child, East Lake Meadows was demolished to make way for revitalization. Atlanta, I'm not sure how many people on the Zoom will know this, that Atlanta was actually the first city in America to build public housing during the 1930s under the New Deal. There was an article in a local paper whose headline read, Southern City becomes the laboratory for Uncle Sam's housing policies. And so Atlanta was very much this kind of laboratory for housing poor and working class Americans. And but around the time that Britt was a child in the 90s, Atlanta would undergo a second kind of great experiment in becoming the first city in America to begin demolishing all of its public housing in favor of this kind of neoliberal attempt um, um, to look to the private market as the kind of guarantor of especially poor and working class people's housing stability. Like the government, as a Reagan deputy put it years earlier, the government was, quote, getting out of the housing business, period. That's what the Reagan HUD deputy said. And in the 90s, Atlanta kind of became what became known as the Atlanta model was very much a kind of attempt to to get the government out of the housing business directly, and to, through housing vouchers and other public subsidies, basically pay the private market to house people. In Britt's own story, that was a dismal, her own life, her own story, that was a dismal failure. Britt and her mother and siblings were not allowed to come back to the mixed income development that emerged in the wake of East Lake Meadows. They actually experienced homelessness when Britt was a child, and fast forwarding to when she was an adult with two kids of her own. She was working at the Atlanta airport when the book opens, working at a restaurant, and she realizes that the only way she's going to keep her kids housed, have a future in the city of her birth, um, is by winning the voucher lottery, by getting a housing voucher. Um, when the book opens, she is sleeping on the living room couch in her great grandmother's apartment with her two kids. Um, and she has 2 years earlier won the voucher lottery, but she's been on the waiting list all this time. She didn't realize that when you win the lottery, you don't actually get a voucher, you get put on a waiting list, and in some cities the waiting list is now more than a decade long. And I just want to mention, by the way, that like the fact we even use the word lottery in relation to this most fundamental human necessity, a place to live, I think is itself damning. So anyway, Britt ends up getting off the waiting list. She's finally given a voucher, and just fast forwarding through her story a bit, she can't find a landlord who will accept her voucher. And so she loses it. She gets an extension from the housing authority. When she still can't find a landlord who will accept it, she loses it. And the year that she loses her voucher, something like 1,100 vouchers were issued to families that year in Atlanta, and about 1,800, I'm sorry, I have it reversed. About 1,800 vouchers were issued to families that year, and about 1,100 expired before they could be used. Like people couldn't find a landlord to accept them. So Britt was not at all uh, this was not at all anomalous. This was a trend. And why weren't these landlords accepting a voucher? Because in a hot rental market like Atlanta's, experiencing the kind of conditions I was alluding to earlier with this celebrated renaissance, the financial incentive to take a voucher had disappeared. Landlords could no longer, if they took a voucher, they couldn't just jack up rents at will. They had to pass certain safety and habitability inspections and standards. And there's also a lot of bureaucratic red tape that you have to go through in order to accept a voucher. So in these gentrifying areas, vouchers were basically impossible to use. And so Britt and her kids, it's interesting because they lose the voucher, and the voucher was really what was supposed to take the place of public housing in America. And in Britt's own life, that is a failure. Interestingly enough, Britt ends up in a low income housing tax credit apartment that she, through a family friend, gets into. And finally, she's like, okay, even though I lost the voucher, I still have this modicum of stability. Because I mean, this apartment was not nice by any means, but it was a home. And, but this apartment complex, the Gladstone that she moved into, it had the misfortune of being near the Beltline, which is kind of the ultimate signifier of the new Atlanta. It's this mixed use trail that circles the city, and anything the Beltline touches, it's like a magic wand has been waved over the area, where, again, property values are soaring and poor people are being pushed out. And she thought that because this was a quote tax credit apartment, that there were certain affordability requirements that would be in place for 30 years. And that was what was kind of publicly known about it. That people could sort of be assured that they could have this affordable apartment at least until I believe it was like 2028. But unbeknownst to the residents, the owner of this property had exploited a little known loophole in the low income housing tax credit program called qualified contract, and had prematurely been released from the affordability requirements. And so I know I was about to say long story short, but it's already been a long story. But long story short, they end up, Britt and all of her neighbors during the pandemic are forced out en masse. And this apartment complex is sold to a developer called Empire Communities, and it's turned into luxury condos. And Britt and her children finally, they have nowhere else to go, and they try getting into homeless shelters. Britt, there are no shelter beds available. Britt can't even allow herself to go that route. It's very hard for her to even accept that this label, this term homeless, could apply to her and her children. She has this feeling like maybe I need to move somewhere else, but where can I even go? And why should I leave the city? The city is as mine as anyone else's. But she's desperate, and nothing materializes, and they begin bouncing around from one friend's apartment to another. And finally, months and months later, Britt returns to the site of this apartment complex where she formerly lived at. And she's standing across the street next to a beer garden that has opened up. And she's looking at this space and she's like, wow, this place will be beautiful when it's finished. And then it's like she catches herself. She remembers that she is in some ways the casualty of all of this new beauty and all of this new success. And she says, but for me and my kids, there's no place for us here. And when she says that, yes, it's a material, it's a comment on her material sort of state, but it's also an existential. It's a reflection of where she is existentially. Like she really feels like there is no place left for her and her children. And in that sense, I just want to conclude this story by saying that the title "There Is No Place for Us," as I've mentioned, is as much a Nashville title, a Charlotte title, a Seattle title, a Philadelphia title. In one city after another. People are feeling this, that there is no place left, that the line separating housed from unhoused has just become devastatingly porous, and that we're, the number of people who are one missed paycheck or one medical emergency or one rent hike or one qualified contract loophole or one landlord refusing to accept a voucher, away from joining the ranks of the newly unhoused in this country.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. We at House Neighbors formed a little book club in preparation for this. Some of us got together and read and discussed, and we talked about kind of like what's a word that describes, how you feel after reading this book or encapsulates. And for me, it was relentless, and kind of think of the story kind of illustrates that of how many points Brit was failed in the system, and every story in your book kind of follow, it's not like one failure point. There's just many that bounced around, and at every turn there's a challenge or um, a failure. And so you already talked a lot about, or a bit about some of the root causes. For us at Housing Neighbors, we usually hone in on the root cause is, the dominance of the private market, and that we've defunded public housing and, taken a privatized approach to affordable housing. Can we take a couple minutes to talk about other kind of key policy or structural failures you go through so many in this book, whether it's tenant protections or just the bureaucratic process of getting affordable housing. But what else floats to the top for you, in addition to what you've talked about that weaves through your book?
I think, I mean, there are so many, but a big revelation for me, I mean, an astonishing revelation really was um, how at every turn in these families' stories and their journeys, there were entire business models that were designed not just to prey upon their desperation, not just to capitalize on their desperation and their suffering, but really to exacerbate it and prolong it and to ensure that it does not end, that it leads to yet another form of predation and exploitation. Um, I, and it really, it ran the gamut from really small scale instances of this, like co-signing companies that are taking advantage of the fact that we now have in this country this vast credit underclass that, and people who don't have wealthy relatives to co-sign for an apartment once your credit score falls below a certain threshold. And so these companies are saying, we'll co-sign for you. And they're kind of the housing equivalent of like a payday lender, or where what seems to be an immediate benefit ends up being extremely predatory in the long run. Things like that, like application fees that landlords and property management companies are charging just because they can. To give you an example, just recently, a family I know sent me an apartment listing wondering if they should apply, and it was demanding, for each applicant, each adult, a $90 application fee, non-refundable, just to do the background check, and then a $250 administrative fee for processing the application, also non-refundable, even if you're rejected. Um, and at one point in the book, Natalia, another person in the book, she's like, she's confronting these fees, and she's like, how are they getting away with this? How are they charging this? And then she answers her own question. Oh, because they can. Because this, when you have literally a captive market, that where people who have no other options except the street, like they will pay anything, they will do anything for shelter. So everything from those kinds of things to much bigger instances of, where I think many people are familiar now with Wall Street and private equity firms buying up both single family homes and also multifamily apartment complexes, and making that housing ever more volatile and insecure and precarious by implementing, everything from automated eviction systems, where if you're even a day late, an eviction is automatically filed against you, to, because they're trying to give maximum returns to their shareholders, cutting security, maintenance, and so forth. But I think what was less familiar to me, at least, was the fact that these same private equity firms are also, they're not just buying up the places people currently live, they're also buying up the very places people go once they lose their housing. So extended stay hotels are just proliferating across the country, and they're concentrated in areas where working people are most likely to not be able to stay housed because of skyrocketing housing costs. And so Extended Stay America, where Maurice and Natalia in the book are living with their children in a tiny, crappy studio-sized hotel room with leaky ceilings and all manner of other awful things in this unit. They paid $17,000 in the span of 8 months at this hotel. And while they were paying that money, which by the way was double what they were paying for an apartment down the road, a two-bedroom apartment down the road, Blackstone and Starwood Capital, two private equity giants, they bought Extended Stay America for $6 billion, because they rightly understood that during a national, affordability and housing crisis, uh, homelessness is big business. That there's a lot of money to be made. As one industry publication put it, extended stay hotels have become a gold mine. And they said, when in doubt, go extended stay. So that was a really stunning revelation to me. There's that James Baldwin line about how in America, how extremely expensive it is to be poor. But I think a lot of what my book illustrates is the flip side of that equation, how extremely lucrative all of this insecurity has become for some. And yeah, so that's a big, it's easy in talking about the housing crisis to only talk about we need more units to come online, and treating the housing and homelessness crisis like, so many numbers on a spreadsheet. But I think when we leave this kind of predatory behavior, this kind of nakedly exploitative behavior out of the conversation, when we fail to really come to terms with what a case manager in the book calls the housing hunger games, when we leave that out, we're really not getting to the heart of the matter. It's not just about getting more more apartments, getting more supply. And I know I've gone on a little at length in answering that, but just stepping back a little bit further from that, I feel like this housing Hunger Games is really it's a manifestation of what, as an anthropologist, I would like to see as something really worth defamiliarizing, really worth kind of looking at with fresh eyes and saying, how utterly bizarre is it that that this is our society, specifically where it comes to housing. I remember during early in the pandemic, there were two brothers in Tennessee who were widely and justly vilified for going around to all the Dollar Generals they could find and buying up hand sanitizer and then selling it on eBay and Amazon for $80, $90 a pop. And I remember thinking, like, that's what we've done to housing in this country. But we don't call it that. We don't call it price gouging. We don't call it profiteering amid an undeclared state of emergency, which is really what we have right now. A true emergency when it comes to people's ability to just have a place to live. We don't call it that. We just call it the law of supply and demand. We just call it the market. And I think if we're going to talk about like what are the systems that need to change or what are the perceptions or paradigms that need to shift in order to really turn the corner on this very much man-made catastrophe. This is not a natural disaster. This is a man-made catastrophe. If we're really going to turn the corner, I think we have to awaken to just how strange it is that we've allowed this essential human need, this essential public good to be hoarded up and auctioned off to the highest bidder in that way.
Yes, you're so totally right. That really leads us to our next question. You're saying we really, in your book, you talk about our solutions up until now have kind of been tweaking around the edges, right? But we really need some really fundamental structural reform. And at the very end, I was wondering because I heard you first on the podcast talking about social housing, and I was reading the book like, when are we going to get to it? And I realized it's the last 2 pages, but I'm really glad I, got all the way through and got to that part because I'll just read a quote or parts of quotes where you say, for years we have opted for piecemeal, better than nothing initiatives that tweak the existing system rather than substantially alter it. And that we need to start treating housing as a public good, which is exactly what House Our Neighbors is here to do, to promote this model of social housing, which I'll define briefly. Our definition, and it can vary depending on where you are, but our definition in Seattle, what we passed, what the voters passed, is housing that is publicly owned, so owned by the government in perpetuity, so it cannot be privatized. It is permanently affordable. Affordable meaning rents do not exceed 30% of your income, and in a lot of places, social housing aims for lower rents than that. And then mixed income. So, we have a history in this country of segregating and creating just these low income programs, public housing, that need constant government subsidies, which is a crucial tool, and we have needed every unit we could get, but we have maxed out those now. We don't have the vouchers are huge waiting lists, and you can't even get housing easily with a voucher. So we need new tools, and what we are advocating for is tools that are really grounded in the public market and not furthering, creation of private housing for profit for a basic need. And so I guess I'm wondering from you, we talked a little bit about this before the session, but when and how did you first learn about social housing, and why do you see it as one of the key tools to undo the ecosystem we've created very deliberately here?
Um, yeah, I'm not sure exactly when I encountered the term social housing. I know it was very early in my reporting, in talking. I spent a lot of time with tenant organizers, tenant unions. It felt very important to me early on, by the way, just to not present myself as some voice in the wilderness who is like calling attention to this, what I don't think is, it's not too much to say, this violence that is so unnecessarily being inflicted on communities around the country. To not present myself like I'm the first one seeing this or saying this, and a lot of my own analysis, my own ideas about why this is happening, even the disciplining of my language away from talking about people falling into homelessness to being pushed into homelessness came from the time I spent just attending tenant organizing meetings, and so I think it was in those circles very early on that I first heard about social housing. Um, and um, but I will say that, at first, I think for a while it was kind of this abstract term. It didn't really pack a punch for me, I guess, until so like another big argument in this book is that homelessness has been just drastically undercounted in America, that there's this entire world of homelessness that isn't just out of sight and invisible, but that has been actively rendered invisible, a kind of manufactured invisibility, where, to the point that all of the families I write about in this book, who I followed, when the point in time count is conducted every year, the federal homeless census, none of the families in this book count. They literally don't count because they are doubled up with others, or they're living in these hotels or staying in their cars. They don't fit HUD's definition of literal homelessness, which is limited to those who are in shelters or on the street. And in a county like DeKalb County, where I live, where right now there isn't a single family shelter, when the last point in time count was conducted, there were 14 homeless families because they were in that shelter. When that shelter closed, there are now zero homeless. I mean, that's really how it happens, where if a shelter closes, so homelessness disappears in that sense, and it's pushed out of sight and really and out of the statistics. And so a big part of what the book is arguing is that the true scale, the true severity of homelessness and housing insecurity in this country is exponentially greater than we've been led to believe. And I say that not just to catastrophize and say, what we already thought was this awful thing is actually much worse. It's to say, like, once we look at the true scale, can we please, like, no longer try to convince ourselves, tell ourselves this comforting story that these, nibble around the edges solutions are going to come anywhere close to addressing this problem at scale. And so once I began to go down that path and looked at the real numbers, and that today, the true scale of homelessness is, I estimate, at least 6 times larger than the official figures. That here in Georgia, where I live, you could gather all of the homeless families and individuals at the Braves Stadium. They would fill that stadium 3 times over, just those who are excluded from the official count in Georgia. And that is replicated around the country. Once you go there, you then have to say, well, what solutions then are capable of truly addressing this at scale? And it was only at that point that social housing was like, oh yeah, that is that, like, we can't, like, yes, we need everything on the table, um you know as a lot of advocates will say, like, we don't have the luxury of choosing either like solely, government intervention or the private market. But I think the idea that 15% of units at 80% AMI over here, or a tiny home village over there, is going to address this crisis at its scale is a delusion. And it's a delusion that, by the way, is very profitable. It's a delusion that a lot of people are invested in maintaining because once housing is removed from the reach of profiteers and speculators, a lot of money is at stake in that removal of housing from the clutches of profiteers and speculators. So anyway, that's kind of the reason why social housing um, came to for me in a very um, I don't know. It took on an urgency and a practicality that it hadn't previously in this, when it had just been this term. And I now come to see social housing, I've now come to see it as like public housing done right, like public housing that wasn't set up to fail from the beginnings, public housing that wasn't systematically defunded and stigmatized, and where poverty wasn't just like concentrated, and where buildings were able to fall into disrepair. Uh, that is what social housing is. Housing for people across income levels, where you don't have to worry about getting a promotion at work because if your income goes above this threshold, you're going to lose your apartment, which is what public housing did in America. That you can stay there even if you make more money. And so, yeah, Vienna, Austria is a place where a lot of attention has been focused because it has been such a shining example of social housing um, uh, as a real success story. Also, Finland effectively ended homelessness um, uh, years ago by the government building social housing on government-owned property. And a lot of times housing first is kind of mentioned in regard to Finland ending homelessness, but social housing was just as much a part of that story. Um, and yeah, so I'm convinced that we need a lot of solutions. There are a lot of things to both prevent homelessness from happening to begin with, so more upstream measures that can be taken to keep people in the homes they currently have. But in order to like truly get people into homes they don't yet have and to make people's housing safe and permanently affordable and dignified, social housing or whatever you want to call it, municipal housing, people are afraid of the word social because it sounds like socialism, whatever you want to call it, publicly owned housing is the way we get out of this crisis. I'm convinced.
Yeah, that is better. Thank you. And the optimistic part is that we are making strides towards this in this country. So Atlanta actually has, they're not calling it social housing, but it's the Atlanta Urban Development Corporation, I believe, is basically producing mixed income publicly owned housing. That is, I think they've maybe broken ground on the first project here in Seattle. Like I said, we have created a social housing developer. We passed an initiative last year to fund it. We estimated that would bring in 50 million from 2025 for social housing. It has actually greatly exceeded that and brought in 130 million. This is a tax on corporations who pay a single employee over $1 million a year, so they are the ones getting taxed. And turns out there are even more very well paid people in Seattle than we even envisioned. So we are on our way to doing this, maybe not at scale, but 130 million in a year gets us a long way. So we should have our first units of social housing this year, which is super exciting. I do want to move on, and we have limited time for Q&A. Before we do that, Brian did mention Vienna as a gold standard of social housing. I will just plug, many of you on here are part of the Social Housing Activator program. This is our kind of recurring donor membership program starting at just $5 a month to support the organizing work of House Our Neighbors. But one really exciting perk of this program is that we are doing a study trip to Vienna this fall in September. And we are going to have a lottery for our social housing activator members to enter, and one person will be selected for a paid seat on this trip to Vienna to experience at scale social housing done right. So I'm going to put that out there for those who are interested. Please do look into signing up. Happy to answer any questions if you want to send me an email. But in the little time we have left, there were a few questions I pulled from the chat. If there are more, please put them in the chat or raise your hand, but I'll get started here by the ones I did have in the chat. Brian, if you want to maybe answer briefly, just because we do have about 6 minutes. The first is, have some cities created a more protective set of policies for low-income workers? How would you describe a healthy ecosystem of housing? Well, I think we've talked about some of the policies, but maybe like in this geographic comparison, like have you seen, other cities or even Atlanta since you wrote this book that have come out with protections?
Uh, okay, so it sounds like that's more oriented toward like worker protections, labor conditions. Um, Yeah, I mean there are many cities around the country uh, that where worker rights are being taken seriously, and sometimes in conjunction with that, tenant rights and where housing justice has come to the fore. Um, Places where the minimum wage has been raised to be commensurate with the cost of living in that place. But um, and yeah, I hesitate to like just. I mean, it's complicated. When it, there are obviously places where the minimum wage has been raised, and we need higher minimum wages. But sometimes those are also places where there has been a lot of resistance to rent stabilization laws. I think that, in short, without going on a huge tangent, um, when we confront the term working homeless, we have to attend just as carefully and rigorously to the working side of it as to the homeless side of it. Like, so obviously on the homeless side, we have housing, we have rents, we have tenant rights, tenant protections. We have the world of homeless services, or the homeless industrial complex, as one person in my book puts it. But we also have to attend to the working side, to not just wages, but the growing volatility and precarity of work itself. As I alluded to earlier, the fact that many jobs, even that pay relatively high wages, also may not give you more than 29 hours a week, because at 30 you would be eligible for basic benefits like health insurance or sick leave. And so the gigification of work, the how insecure work itself has become, it has to be part of that conversation. And yeah, so I'll just stop there.
Also, the other thing is the childcare and childcare costs is something that really hit me from your book because I'm a parent and I have paid for daycare, but just for these, so it was just a
Absolutely.
cycle of you couldn't look for housing and you couldn't work. You couldn't have childcare, but if you didn't have childcare, you couldn't.
I'll just say that we have to have an analysis that is expansive enough to encompass all of these domains that economists may slice up into disparate realms, but that is not how life is lived. You pull one thread and the whole thing comes apart. So childcare, healthcare, work, all of it is connected, housing. And we have to have an analysis and a politics, frankly. And I know I'm not supposed to say this to journalists, but I've given up any pretense, as you can tell, of being just a dispassionate observer. We need a politics that is capable of encompassing all of these domains at once.
Another question is you've talked about how many more people are homeless that are not part of point in time counts. And do you know, like, how is this information or data collected or estimated? Or I guess, it's not. The people who are in your book are not being captured, but are they more now? Like, are those methods changing or?
There is some really powerful and important research. It actually started with the Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness. That was an early exemplar of a more, a more a wider lens on those who are truly homeless in a given city. And when they published their findings, which included those who were doubled up, it didn't even include those in hotels and motels or these extended stays, but just when they included those doubled up, I believe the chasm between the official number and the number they found was something, it was like 13 times greater. And so that methodology that they came up with was then it was built into a national model, a methodology using American Community Survey data to give an estimate of everyone in the U.S. who is doubled up, and it's by cobbling together that number along with the Department of Education, which does have a more expansive definition of homelessness that includes families in hotels, by using their albeit flawed, very undercounted sort of data on student homelessness, cobbling that together with the doubled up figures, that's where I get a conservative estimate that the actual number is about 6 times greater than the official number nationwide.
Got it. Thank you. And one last quick one. I saw someone asking for book recommendations. I'll just say for me, a couple that come to mind are Color of Law, which goes into like, our history of exclusionary housing policies. And then Poverty for Profit, which is not housing, but is kind of what you were talking about, the privatization of poverty and different angles of that. That one's less storytelling and more dense, wonky, but definitely gives in depth there. And then I haven't actually read it, but Evicted, I think, is one that is, similar to style of yours that goes into, tenant issues. Any recommendations from you, Brian?
I would recommend a book called Capital City by Samuel Stein. I cite that book in my own, especially in discussing gentrification. The subtitle of Samuel Stein's book is uh, Gentrification in the Real Estate State. So he's really interested in showing how before a place becomes gentrified, it first has to become gentrifiable, and that happens at the level of city planning, or to be precise, a kind of collusion of urban planning and real estate capital. So if you really want to understand gentrification in a more nuanced way, I'd highly recommend Capital City. And also my friend Tracy Rosenthal um, co-wrote a book with a tenant organizing colleague called Abolish Rent. And I love the title, Abolish Rent. It's meant to be a provocation. It's meant to force us to ask ourselves, like, why do we even need this system of collecting rent and in having this entire class of people in the richest nation on the planet who are constantly at the mercy of a landlord whose sole motive may be profit. Why must they be at the mercy of that landlord just to have this most basic human necessity? So it's an incredible reorientation around housing and its possibilities, and really goes deep into how we got into this set of assumptions that we are forced to live with today, where one's ability to have a roof overhead is so utterly unpredictable and contingent on someone else's um, uh, profit motive.
Thank you so much. And of course, we already sent the link, but make sure you pick up a copy of Brian's book. It's in paperback now, so even more available and accessible. Um, Really, learned a lot from reading this. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us and for sharing your experience and just your perspective on everything that you learned. And hope to stay connected. Thank you,
Thank you so
everyone, for
much.
joining today.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.